Hi. Up until this point in our study of ethics, we've been attempting to approach the subject from a sort of philosophical, conceptual, or theoretical standpoint. We've been attempting to understand various different theories, theoretical approaches to the subject that help us to sort of grasp the fundamental principles that are at stake when we talk about ethics or morality. I would like to take something of a different standpoint in this video, or a different approach. And in fact, the approach that we've been taking until now, it's somewhat, in fact, it's quite an anomaly in respect to, well, I'll just say that through most of the life of humanity, and also most of our individual lives, so both the life of humankind and also our own lives, thinking about ethics in the way that we've been thinking about it, which is to say in terms of principles or theories, lucid conceptual apprehension of ethics. This is something quite unusual, comparatively speaking. Most of our own lives, and also most of the life of humanity, has rather approached ethiks through the standpoint of stories or myths or parables and proverbs. In other words, the narrative component of ethic, the narrative. So story has been a sort of vessel of communication for ethics. In the same way that, well, we've been attempting to apprehend ethics through the vessel of various philosophers that have attempted to sort of distill the core and essential principles. Again, through most of history and also in most of our lives, we actually learn our ethics. We receive our ethical education through stories, and in fact, we think of our lives, and we think of we frame everything that happens in a narrative framework, and so again, this has been found to be quite a powerful and also complex, also a very rich way of communicating ethical precepts without doing so explicitly in the way that we've been trying to do. And so basically, this course on ethics has been trying to make explicit these fundamental understandings that are fundamental ethical understandings that are usually somewhat tacit or implicit. But we learn them from somewhere. And again, I think the place that we learn them is from the stories that we tell and the stories that we encounter in our lives. In this lecture, I would like to use the book of Job as something of a representative example of how a story can convey ethical teaching in an extremely powerful and rich and complex way. This is not to say that the theoretical or conceptual approach that we've been taking is not any of those things. But sometimes we can imagine that for example, ancient stories are somehow primitive, or they sort of they're missing something. When we think of myths, we often think of something like the childhood of humanity, so to speak. And similarly, when we think of fairy tales, we think of fairy tales as something that are appropriate for young children, but that we somehow grow out of in the course of our lives. And this is partly true, but it also fails to recognize just the depth that can be contained in apparently simple stories. Now, this is not to say that the book of Job is simple, and in fact, it's quite difficult to understand. What I'll try to do in this lecture is first just say a little bit about the sort of the background of a story like this and a traditional myth. But then I'll try to basically summarize the book of Job from a very sort of just preliminary and superficial standpoint. And then I'll just address what has largely been the sort of hallmark or the signature of the Book of Job in terms of thinking about the order of the cosmos and something sort of theological approach to the Book of Job, what it tells us about the nature of the world and the nature of God, etc. This is intimately related with what is called the problem of evil, or Theodicy, which is basically the question of if God is good, why is it that just people suffer? And I'll say a few words about that question. And then finally, I would like to, again, this is all something of a survey, but I would like to finish by trying to approach the Book of Job from something like a, perhaps I should call it a psychological interpretation, or rather, what it tells us about, or what it can reveal to us about the process of inner transformation in some way. I mentioned in the last video the concept of metanoia, which is in English translated as repentance. But again, that's quite a misleading translation because metanoia foremost means to indicate some kind of internal revolution or internal turning about. And so those are basically the three things that I will try to cover in this video. First, the sort of literal or straightforward interpretation of the Book of Job. Second, something of just approaching some of the theological issues that are at stake. And then third, trying to lay out how it can be something of a roadmap of inner transformation. Before I say more about the actual narrative itself, I should just mention, we'll just try to paint some of the context of the Book of Job. It's many scholars believe it's actually one of the oldest stories in the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, of course, is a compilation of texts that were written over the course of hundreds of years, and so each one. I mean, so you can imagine there's quite a large span of time in which these different works were composed. But it's actually imagined that the Book of Job was one of the first, and so it's an extremely ancient text. Scholars usually date the Book of Job from between 500 and 700 BC. So this is close to 3,000 years ago. It's roughly contemporaneous with the works of Homer. So in Greece, as the Iliad and the Odyssey were first being recorded in written language, approximately the same time in the Middle East, the Book of Job was first being recorded. Like all of these, in every one of these cases, the first time a text is written down, you can be fairly confident that the text is only written down after it has been transmitted orally, so spoken through word of mouth for centuries, and so we have to imagine that the text that we inherit, it's somehow a condensation of living of spoken and living stories, and before, if we can imagine the society before writing, we have to imagine that whoever would speak, the poet, whoever would speak, this person would really appear to be inspired by some kind of higher knowledge, and it might sound strange today, but I think if we can really imagine this, that it's not as though you could just pick up a book anywhere you wanted and find a story in it. It's rather any story or any myth that you heard, you always heard it firsthand from somebody. This person would speak. The story would only be heard through this person's mouth. And it's again, it's not as though you imagine that there's a library, like a catalog somewhere of all these different myths and stories. Not at all. It's rather, it's something oral. It's always presented in real time in the living moment. And so we can imagine I say that just to try to help us enter into this very, which can be very challenging. It's to enter into a time that is not our own, and it takes real intensity of imagination to try to really enter empathetically into the way ancient people would have, what a story like the Book of Job would have meant to ancient people. And so we have to cast ourselves back again thousands of years into again a time and a country that is very distant from us. But at the same time, despite the vast distance that we perceive in the Book of Job, something about the Book of Job also confronts us as intimately familiar in just the sort of the fundamental questions and the humanity of Job. When we encounter that, we immediately somehow recognize something like we recognize something familiar in Job. I say this by way of sort of trying to account for why we imagine that out of innumerable different stories, certain stories survived over thousands of years, and the only reason they survived is because people made the decision to preserve them. It's not as though the stories, they just last by themselves. It's rather people have to transcribe them over and over again, translating them, preserving them through all kinds of adversity, etc. And so we have to imagine that any story that has survived for 3,000 years, it's quite naive to just dismiss the story as though it, despite that it survived for so long, that it doesn't have some kind of deep value. And so when we encounter the Book of Job and we realize that it's been preserved for almost 3,000 years, this should give us a moment to open ourselves to the possibility that there's something really worth preserving in this story. And again, you imagine the countless other stories that were not preserved. Something about the Book of Job, it values that kind of, or it bears that kind of value to be worth preserving for so long. And so just by way of brief synopsis, the Book of Job begins actually with something like a prologue in heaven. And it's something like God almost boasts. He makes a boast to Satan. And Satan, interestingly, Satan, Satan, I believe it would be pronounced in Hebrew, it has a literal meaning. We think of Satan as a proper name in the way that other people have proper names, so Satan is the name of something. But like many proper names, in fact, Satan actually does have a literal meaning. And the meaning of Satan is the adversary, or the sort of the obstacle, the obstacler, if we could coin a word. And so this adversary, so God actually boasts to Satan and says, Satan, have you seen how virtuous and how upright and how noble is this man on the earth called Job? God is basically almost tempting the devil, and Satan says, Satan responds by saying, the only reason that he is so virtuous and so noble is because you've basically bestowed so many blessings on him that of course somebody would be noble and be virtuous if he received all of these graces from you. The real test would be whether he's still virtuous even if he doesn't receive those rewards from you as God, as the creator of the universe. And so then in some way Satan turns it around and almost tempts God and says, let's see how well your man on the earth, Job, let's see how well he could endure a situation in which everything that all of his rewards, all of his basically he's almost being, from Satan's point of view, Job is almost being bribed into being virtuous because of all these blessings that God has bestowed on him. And so Satan says, well, let's see if he's still virtuous, even if we take away all of these benefits and all of these blessings. And it's quite interesting, the dialogue between them, because God says, okay, go ahead. And God somehow has confidence in Job, that Job would prove himself. But he tells Satan, he says, and just to kind of summarize a back and forth, a somewhat lengthy dialogue, God says, you can take away all of these things from him, but you can't harm him. In other words, you can't do anything to Job's soul. And so first Satan actually basically deprives Job of all of his possessions, and Job thinks of his his own family as his possessions, his own sons and daughters, and in fact they're killed because a house collapses on them. So Job, basically, his first trial is to be deprived, bereft of everything that he owns, so to speak, all of his exterior riches. In one fell swoop, he's deprived of them. He in the next, and Job sort of almost, it's quite strange in the beginning, and I'll speak about this at the end of the lecture when I try to tease forth what might be a sort of internal or esoteric narrative here, which has to do with Job's inner transformation throughout the story. But I will just sort of make a bookmark here, so to speak, and just notice how stoic almost Job responds to being deprived of, well, to the death of his own family. All at once the house collapses on him, and just like that, his sons and daughters are killed. And his only response is something so almost heartless, almost unfeeling. He says, "The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And so he's almost just again, there's some kind of vacuity or emptiness that Job expresses. It's like he's just repeating these words. And of course, anyone who had been through such a tragedy, we imagine they're doing everything they can just to hold it together. But nevertheless, there is something strangely lacking with Job's response. Next, the devil comes to God and petitions to God to basically afflict Job, not only of everything that he owns, but also of his body. So everything that also is in some way a little bit more immediate. So you imagine a sort of body in an extended sense is your world, your maybe your possessions, your house, etc. The house is kind of a metaphor for the body. The household can be a metaphor for the body. And then Satan inflicts this the same kind of harm onto Job's body itself. And so Job is afflicted with pestilence and disease and so this again is a sort of a more somehow it's more immediate than what had just befallen him. And again, Job just kind of responds, and he appears to be somehow passing this test that he doesn't really know about, because he basically maintains his unwaveringly. He basically maintains that same attitude, which is like, again, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And at that point, after he's afflicted with the plague and boils, etc., his wife comes to him and says, she basically enjoins him to she says, curse God and die. And Job, he rebukes her and he says, this is like sort of lack of faith or something. But then Job is after receiving all of these afflictions, then Job is the story says that he's silent for 7 days. Like he stops and he can't speak for 7 days. In the meantime, his 3 friends have come, and they come under the pretense of coming to offer some kind of consolation or comfort to Job. But again, he's stricken with this silence for 7 days, and so they arrive, and then Job goes into the 7 days of silence. And after the 7 days is up, then suddenly his silence breaks, and it's like a dam, and just pours forth, and he wails and he moans, and he sort of he begins to curse his fate, and he says he curses the day that he was born. He wishes he was never born, and his friends. So then what next follows is the kind of the body of the book of Job. It's a dialogue or an exchange between Job and his 3 friends, and his each friend will give a sort of speech, and then Job will answer. And the friends basically take the position that so Job begins to curse God, and he says, I've done nothing wrong. Nevertheless, I've had all of these punishments inflicted on me. His friends immediately respond, and each one of them in their own way. Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. Each one responds to Job by basically saying, almost mechanically, they're sort of they have a quality of like mechanical repetition of what they've learned, theologically speaking, and they basically they tell Job, like, look, we know for a fact that there's a sort of they view human life and in relation to the divine, they view it as a sort of scorekeeping. So like if you do virtuous things on earth, then God will reward you. And they have this really fixed idea, almost a mechanical view of the sort of transactional relation between the above and the below. And so they say, look, if all of these evils are befalling you, obviously you did something wrong. So why don't you just repent and, in the sense of ask for forgiveness from God? Why don't you just admit that you did something wrong, and rather than holding out? And it's quite strange, because Job is often in the most common interpretation of the book of Job. Job is kind of put forward as this paragon of sort of devout and unwavering commitment and unwavering faith in God. Job is viewed as the sort of the suffering servant, almost, who refuses to curse God. But reading through the text, that's not the picture you get at all, in fact. For most of the text, Job is actually coming very close to cursing God himself. But the most salient, he certainly curses a lot of the decisions that God appears to have made. The most salient aspect in the dialogue between Job and his friends, the thing that stands out the most is the fact that his friends are telling him, look, if these evils are befalling you, they say basically the premise, the sort of axiom. This is a sort of a premise that's just kind of taken as a matter of faith. We know that God is just, and so then you can imagine sort of argument structure. It's like, God is just, evil things don't happen to good people. Evil things have happened to you. Therefore, you must have done something to anger God, and you deserve what's happening to you. So they basically say, look, you obviously deserve what's happened to you. We don't know how, but we know for a fact that God is good. God is just. That's the position that his friends take. Job is totally unconvinced, and the most obvious or salient aspect of Job's point of view, at least in the beginning of the dialogue, is that his real confidence doesn't appear to be in God's justice, because he actually demands an explanation from God. Like, why is this happening to me? His real faith appears to actually be in his own virtue, his own lack of blemish. Job is totally convicted, and with complete certainty, he says that I haven't done anything wrong. Over and over again, he repeats this: I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this. This conversation between the friends, again, it goes back and forth. There doesn't appear to be much. Well, Job certainly doesn't succeed in convincing his friends that he hasn't done anything wrong. That's probably because they're unconvincible, in the sense that they clearly have a fixed idea about the nature of God. It's quite interesting, though, to and again, this is something that I'll try to pick up on at the end of this lecture. But it's quite interesting to notice the subtle way in which Job's answers to his friends, so the answers that Job gives to his friends. At first, Job is totally convinced that he doesn't deserve what he's receiving, and he actually demands God to. He demands a sort of he says he wants to put God on trial, and basically make God defend himself, make God defend his actions, because from Job's point of view, whatever he's getting, he doesn't deserve. As the dialogue and the exchange goes on, there's maybe a subtle shift in the way that Job answers, and it becomes a little bit less. The emphasis changes a little bit from a concern with affirming over and over again, with Job over and over again affirming his own lack of sin. This appears to be the emphasis in the beginning of Job's answers. By the end, the emphasis seems to have shifted, and it's much more to sort of acknowledging or sort of recognizing God's omnipotence or God's supreme power, and almost and with that goes almost a sense of arbitrariness. It's almost a charge of so Job almost appears to be charging God with just being so powerful that he's arbitrary and unfeeling, and that he just basically he has no, that God has no concern for the beings on the earth. I feel that by summarizing it, obviously if the book of Job could just be summarized, it wouldn't be necessary to preserve the book of Job. Something, a work of art like this, a work of poetry like this, if it could be said any other way than the way it's said, we wouldn't bother to preserve the thing. And so I just want to emphasize the fact that by giving a summary, I don't pretend to be substituting for the book itself, because the dialogues and the exchanges, the exhortations, they're so moving and so powerful that I encourage anyone who hasn't read it, or anyone who has read it, to read it again. But and so then after they go back and forth, and each one of his three friends basically challenges Job. They each do it 2 times, and then Bildad and Zephyr, they do it a third time, but each time Job gives an answer, but they appear to be at some kind of stalemate. Like, in other words, no one has really changed his mind, despite the sort of subtle change that I mentioned that Job might be going through. And then there comes a sort of strange, something unexpected, and it's only unexpected because a character comes in, and there's no mention of where he came from, and he also departs just as mysteriously as he came in. In other words, when he's finished speaking, again, you don't really hear anything about him. But what he says is too important to just skip over. And so this character is named Elihu, and it's interesting to kind of speculate on the name again, because Satan again has a literal meaning in Hebrew, which is something like the adversary, or the obstacler, the one who puts obstacles in people's paths. Elihu, when we think of, the word in Hebrew for God itself is El, and Elihu in Hebrew might mean something like the one who is with God, or the one whom God is with, this one. And so again, this just his name only contributes to the enigmatic character of this figure called Elihu, who again appears spontaneously. Apparently he was listening to the dialogue all along, but he introduces himself after the stalemate between the friends, and he says, "You're all older than I am." So he introduces himself as comparatively young compared to these ones who have been arguing. He says, "You're all older than I am, so I have done my best to bite my tongue, so to speak, and not to interject in this dialogue until now. But now that you've all spoken, I can't hold back my." He's actually enraged, or he's angry in some way, and because he feels that all parties have misrepresented the truth, and he basically says, when I speak, he's basically feels that he's speaking. He's lending his own voice. He's lending himself to be the mouthpiece of wisdom, is what he says. And he basically says he rebukes all parties all around, and he says, you all have the wrong idea about this. And he says like, for example, Job, you think that you're being, you think that God inflicts, so Job's friends think that God inflicts harm, or inflicts, Job's friends are arguing that the harm comes from out of punishment, like God is being retributive, and basically keeping score and punishing somebody who deserves it. And he says that's just that's not the right conception. He basically says God inflicts punishment in order to he literally says in order to open their ears. In other words, it's not just punishment that God inflicts. It's not just for the reason of punishment that God inflicts teaching. It's also for the sake of that it's not just for punishment that God inflicts harm. It's also for teaching. In other words, the punishment that God inflicts, it seems to be punishment, but it also can be for the sake of making people receptive to learn something. I'm just scrolling to try to find the passage. He says, this is Ellie speaking in chapter 36. And again, he's sort of rebuking this concept that Job and the friends were arguing over. And he says that just doesn't capture the truth. This is Ellie speaking. He says, and if they are bound in fetters and caught in cords of affliction, then he declares them their work and their transgression. So God somehow reveals to them what is actually the case, that they're behaving arrogantly. He opens their ears to instruction. In other words, the Job, Bildad, Eliphaz, and excuse me, I can't remember these names. Zophar. Job, Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz. They have this idea that when something, again, there's a sort of cosmic scorekeeping, and when you do something wrong, then God punishes you, and that's the concept of God they have. Elihu challenges this concept, and he says it's superficial, and he says that rather than thinking of it as sort of retribution, and so punishment and reward, he says the point of trials can be rather for the sake of making us receptive to wisdom. And then almost just as I want to make a sort of bookmark here that I'll return to because it's clear that up until this point the idea of a sort of scorekeeping, in other words, that good deeds are rewarded by God and evil deeds are punished. Their idea of scorekeeping has to do with purely, basically it's material possessions. In other words, if you act virtuously, then God will reward you with sheep or sons and daughters or cattle, etc., or gold. And similarly, if you do something vicious, then God will punish you by revoking those things and maybe even inflicting onto you some kind of plague or pestilence. And again, this is the working idea of God that Job and his three friends had. And Job is basically, he's saying, because I didn't do anything wrong, therefore it's unfair that I receive these kind of afflictions. But again, this is his premise is that the cosmic order is fair in that way, in the sort of scorekeeping way. Similarly, his friends are saying, they're again affirming that the universe has that kind of reciprocal sort of retribution or reward for good deeds and punishment for evil deeds. And so they're saying, because you're being punished, therefore you must have done something wrong. Elihu's challenge suddenly reveals a new dimension to this question, because what if the scorekeeping, what if the scorekeeping is not accounting for everything that's really at stake here, that's everything that's really important. And so again, I'll try to pick up on that idea at the end when I try to approach the sort of more interior or psychological approach, a sort of an approach of that tries to track Job's transformation throughout the story. But just to try to finish the brief summary and cursory overview, after Elihu speaks, then suddenly God appears from the whirlwind, it says. God speaks out of a whirlwind. And again, Job had the idea that he wanted to bring God on trial and sort of hear an argument from him, a defense. He wanted God to defend himself logically. And that's not at all what he gets, because God just comes and says, it is amazingly, again, this amazingly poetic speech, and God says, like, he begins and he says to Job, he says like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? In other words, like, how can you even imagine, how can you even presume to be able to sort of, hold me accountable, like, as though you can really keep score in the way that you imagine. And God just goes on to describe all of the, sort of his awesome power. And it's basically like, look, if you want to complain about me and think that I'm arbitrary or evil or something, like, you have no idea what I'm capable of, that obviously I haven't done. And so don't be too quick to draw conclusions. Again, you're imagining that you can somehow fathom something divine in your limited conception, in your limited mind. And then amazingly, Job, after, maybe it's not amazing at all, Job is totally sort of awestruck and bewildered and just almost speechless. And he doesn't receive a sort of, kind of like point by point refutation of his argument, but when God finishes speaking, Job doesn't really have anything further to say. And then the story concludes by saying that actually, after everything sort of everything simmered down and resolved, then God decided to bless Job again with twofold of everything that he had before. So he ends up twice as well off as he started in the story. So in some way, it's like the story might be appearing to affirm this idea, actually, after having questioned it. It might be appearing to affirm the idea of again, a sort of scorekeeping. And so with that, I'll conclude this. I just kind of tried to walk through sequentially, tried to walk through the dialogue, just to sort of have a picture of it arrayed before us. And now I'll turn towards just trying to treat two of what I think are important themes in this story. And I before I say anything further, though, I do just want to emphasize that nothing that I say even comes close to exhausting the riches that are contained in a story like this. And I think we've seen up until this point in the ethics class that any of the approaches that we've taken, that there's so much that can be said about each one of them. And again, I think a story like this, it's at least as rich as any one of the theories that we've encountered. And so again, I don't want to pretend that I'm somehow giving an exhaustive interpretation or exegesis of this story. But that being said, there are two points that I would like to address. One of them is somewhat more in the sense of the way that Job has been conventionally interpreted. Maybe the most conventional interpretation, again, I've already mentioned, but it's sort of, Job presents a sort of role model in the way that we talked about with Aristotelian virtue ethics, where Job is a sort of exemplar or paragon who embodies these critical virtues, or the most esteemed and the most essential virtues of a given culture. We can contrast this with Homeric epics and think of characters like Odysseus or Achilles, and it's obvious that they also present a certain virtues to anyone who reads the story. And it will, I think, be just as apparent the stark contrast between the sort of warrior, heroic, Homeric Greek ethos and the characters that are being exalted. Again, exemplary characters are Achilles and Odysseus. The contrast is, it's an amazing contrast to then consider the character that the Hebrew tradition is exalting, this Job, because in some way he's so much more, despite being a sort of virtuous householder, etc., he's also, in some way he's somewhat not exactly pitiful or pathetic, because he does he's afflicted with so many hardships, but he spends so much time sort of feeling sorry for himself. And again, this is one of the reasons that when we encounter Job, we immediately feel sort of familiarity or resonance, because he does seem at once he seems so human. We all in some ways will tend to feel sorry for ourselves. In the Greek, in some traditions, like the Greek one, for example, this is not seen as a virtue. Sort of feeling like you've been the subjected to unfairness, and that you've been a victim of something. This is not seen as a virtue in the Greek, from the Greek view. And again, you can tell because these role models that are presented in the Homeric epics, there's not one iota of sort of lamenting their own fate. By contrast, Job, this is clearly this sort of basic vulnerability or sense of feeling sort of bemoaning one's fate, in fact, and sort of asking God for trying to enter into a dialogue with God, or an understanding of God's actions. This is clearly something that's put forward, by contrast in the Jewish Bible through the figure of Job. This is something that's put forward as a virtue. The reason that I mention this is just to show the way in which these stories, again, they're like, well, to use Homer is famous for in the Iliad, the image of the Trojan horse, which is the way that the Greeks enter into the city of Troy. In some way, these stories, they're also can be seen in that way, as they're like vessels that basically they convey different virtues to us as we're reading them. We see certain virtues that are embodied, that Job embodies. We see certain virtues that other characters embody. And so quite a conventional interpretation of Job is that he somehow embodies the virtue of being somebody who has unwavering faith in God, and somehow, despite all the devil's attempts to thwart him, that Job somehow remains steadfast in his faith in God. And so Job is somehow viewed as a role model of how we can in the face of all external ills and afflictions, that we can somehow maintain our inner fortitude. It's clear that there's many passages in the book of Job that support this view, but I think it will be just as clear reading through it that there are probably just as many passages that call this view into question. And so I don't mean to pretend to reject that view out of hand, but I do want to suggest that there's much more that can be gleaned from the book of Job than merely that sort of external image of a virtuous person. Perhaps the second most common or most conventional interpretation of the book of Job has to do with a theological question. And so at the beginning I said I would try to divide this lecture into three parts. So one of them being a sort of summary and cursory progression through the narrative itself. And then the second one I said would be a sort of just a little bit of an exploration of one of the key theological issues that's at stake. And so that's what I'll try to say a little bit about right now. And that has to do with the question of, it's often called the problem of evil, or the Theodicy. And it's trying to resolve this logical contradiction. And I think if I explain the philosophical question that's at stake, I think it will immediately be recognizable to someone who's read the book of Job, how this is indeed right at the crux of especially the dialogue between Job and his friends. The problem of evil goes basically, again, it's like assuming that God is just. How is it that bad things happen to good people? And in fact, there's a quite pithy and and extremely concise formulation of the problem of evil that we inherit from one of the ancient Greek philosophers called Epicurus. And Epicurus, in some ways, was a proto-utilitarian. He had the idea that the good life was the life of maximizing sensual pleasure, basically. And Epicurus, he was a contemporary of Plato and Aristotle. And so Epicurus says, he says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is God able but not willing to prevent evil? Then he is malevolent. Is God both able and willing to prevent evil? Then where does it come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And so this, again, this sort of encapsulates the problem of evil in no uncertain terms. It's like there's some kind of a, it's an aporetic tetrad. In other words, these things don't fit together. If we have to affirm that good things seem to happen, or good things seem to happen to evil people. Evil things seem to happen to good people. It seems we have no choice but to affirm that's true. It also seems that what we mean by God seems to be, a sort of divine, omnipotent being who is also benevolent. Those two propositions, they don't seem to be compatible. And again, the book of Job really brings that sort of that problem into stark relief. Because again, Job is he's presented as a virtuous person. Nevertheless, all of these evil, or these hardships and afflictions befall him. It seems to cast into doubt or cast aspersions on the idea that either that the world is fair, so to speak. In other words, that virtue is rewarded. It seems that we would either have to doubt that proposition, or we would have to doubt that God is actually benevolent and omnipotent in that way. It's interesting to think of the way in which the book of Job, I don't know if it exactly resolves that problem, but the way it treats that problem. There's a couple different conclusions we could draw. One of them is something that you might just call the sort of unfathomability thesis, or the incomprehensibility thesis, and that's the idea that that's like wisdom for mortals is folly for God, or something like that. It would be to say that God's working and the universe, it's so vast that we can't possibly, that it's just incomprehensible to us. And so, in other words, to try to keep score about good people and evil people, and good consequences and evil consequences, there's only one being that's capable of doing that, and that being is God. And so we shouldn't really presume to be able to again sort of keep track of all of these different variables. That might be one conclusion to draw, and just following from God's speech at the end, where he, out of the whirlwind, when God speaks out of the whirlwind, and he says, could you chain the Behemoth, and could you hook the Leviathan, and where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? In other words, like, how can you possibly comprehend the grandeur of this question? Which is quite a compelling answer, and it's certainly, in some ways, it was enough to silence Job, and it would be enough to silence me, certainly, if I was in Job's position. Another way, though, it's not, again, part of what makes this story so interesting is because it does not lend itself to just some kind of, anytime we think there's a singular, univocal, straightforward explanation, then it's easy to leave something behind. You sort of close the book and say, it was an allegory, and I understood the moral of the story, and so now I can move on. The book of Job will never let us move on. We can never move on from the book of Job, because it is so it's so complex and rich and seemingly contradictory because you might imagine that in fact it affirms exactly what was called into question, because sure enough, Job is rewarded twice, twofold. Everything that was taken away from him, apparently, according to the narrative, that was restored to him twice over. So then we might imagine that, in fact, Job is being rewarded for, who knows, in some way he was quite faithful and unwavering. In some ways it might not be clear what he's being rewarded for, because he did seem to challenge God and seem to doubt God's goodness, God's justice, God's mercy, etc. But he's being, if we don't think of it as reward, we would still have to say we would think of it as compensation. And so whether we think of it as reward or not, we still have to see it as sort of affirming this idea of cosmic scorekeeping. Because again, the story ends by everything being restored, all of Job's material possessions being restored to him. And so we can see that the theological problem, the Theodicy, the problem of evil, it's clearly a very essential tenet in this story. So lastly, I would just like to say a few words about another approach to the same story, and I don't in any way mean to suggest that what I'm about to say is sort of rejects or refutes or contradicts what I've said until now. And in fact, that's one of the virtues of myth in the first place, which is that again, that it's so multivalent, and because it's so multivalent, it can contain so much teaching and so much wisdom. In sort of again, there's sort of different strata of interpretation, and none of them is exclusive by itself. Each of them can be correct, but not exclusively correct. And so I would like to say a few words about something that I don't think is a conventional interpretation of Job. It's something that in reading, returning to the book of Job over the last couple of days to prepare for this lecture, I certainly didn't encounter this perspective, but it is something that it's something that's been turning over in my mind and heart, and so I would like to at least offer it as a theory and maybe look forward to hear anybody's responses. But so this would have to do with something like Job as an allegory for the story of Job as actually a depiction of Job's inner psychological or spiritual transformation. In other words, Job's metanoia, his moment of or his experience of conversion. And so the question is, one way to try to approach this question is to say, okay, there's Job at the beginning of the book of Job, and there's Job at the end. How is Job different at the beginning compared to at the end? What changes in Job over the course of the story? And in some way we have to say, if nothing really changes for Job over the story, then was this story really worth telling in the first place? And so that was kind of my departure point for this sort of exploration. And so I'll just return to I guess first I'll just sort of outline, in every story, it's almost like the archetype of a story is that there's some kind of equilibrium, and then the equilibrium is shattered. There's a sort of a symmetry breaking, and then there's a problem or a trial or something goes wrong, and then the story ends with a kind of resolution. And so just departing from that schematic archetype, then the question is what is the sort of equilibrium at the beginning, and I think it's pretty clear what is the disruption to that equilibrium. It's when Satan, the adversary, comes and disrupts things, and then the question is, how is the equilibrium restored, and what is the difference between the equilibrium before the intervention and after? And I guess the theory that I would suggest is that at the beginning of the dialogue, Job is presented as the most pious man in the East. And the East gives a kind of image of sort of learning and spirituality and high attainments of religion. And Job is again, he's put forth as somebody who's something like an exemplar, sort of a pious, an exemplar of piety. But I guess the theory that I have is that at the beginning, Job has a kind of external piety. Then there's this disruption. The devil comes, disrupts this equilibrium of external piety, and then Job has to go through a sort of a cycle. It's like a descent and then a return. And by that I mean, Job begins as somebody externally pious. He then enters into this trial, and he becomes he first becomes resentful. He curses the day he was born. He blames God for being arbitrary, etc., and so on. Then the third stage is that Job suddenly he has a change of heart, a change of mind. He has this metanoia, and then the equilibrium at the end. Job is again portrayed as a sort of pious man with a sort of ultimate and seemingly very strong faith in God. But there's a fundamental difference. The difference is that Job's faith at the beginning was a sort of external. He was able to repeat these rote phrases almost in a mechanical way. He was able to say, again, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. He was able to just repeat that in the face of all of this adversity. By the end of the book of Job, in some way it might seem the same, because he basically just there's God. God doesn't explain himself. He just kind of demonstrates his incomprehensible power, and Job again appears to just say, that's how it is. But something is fundamentally different. There's a radical difference, and the difference is that in the beginning, Job's faith is kind of external or mechanical. In the end, Job's piety is something that's been, it's the fruits. It's been born from experience. Job is internally pious at the end. You know, he doesn't just sort of believe in God, so to speak. He knows because he's encountered God. And so then in some way the story tells of that transformation, how Job gets from point A to point B, so to speak, from the alpha to the omega. And so I'll just try to mention a few points that I think at least stood out to me if I read this story through, if I looked at this story through that window, so to speak. The first one is, I've mentioned this already, but he seems almost mechanical at the beginning. And I think the very expressive moment of Job's, and by mechanical I mean he's just going through the motions, and he doesn't really, so for example, his family, the people around him, his own sons, for example, in the first chapter in the book of Job, it mentioned, just by way of trying to present Job as such an upstanding figure, it says that he thinks that Job thinks his own sons are virtuous, but just in case, because he doesn't know he says they appear to act virtuously, but he doesn't know what's in their hearts. I can read it. It says, "For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and blasphemed God in their hearts." And so for this reason, Job has a habit continually offering sacrifices on behalf of his own children. And basically it's presenting Job as though, well, in some ways it's like, oh, how magnanimous of Job to be offering sacrifices on behalf of other people. But at the same time, it's interesting what it also suggests, which is that that Job, he doesn't really have he doesn't really connect with people around, with his own sons, for example, and other people around him too, but he doesn't know what's in his own sons' hearts. And this seems to be, again, this seems to be a leitmotif throughout the whole book of Job, which is people encounter one another, but not really. And so throughout most of the book is this exchange of speeches between Job and his friends. And it's obvious that none of them are really, they're not really meeting one another, so to speak. Nothing that Job says changed his friend's mind, and nothing that his friends say changed Job's mind, so to speak. They're not able to sort of, meet one another mind to mind or heart to heart, so to speak. And this seems again to characterize Job's kind of externality. And then again, I think we see this. This is kind of a how would I say? It's almost a fractal iteration of Job's relationship to God, which again seems to be quite maybe superficial isn't the right way, but it's almost rote or mechanical. It's like Job doesn't really he doesn't experience anybody. He doesn't experience anyone other than himself. And this again then is it characterizes Job's for the first half of the dialogue. Job is over and over again sort of bemoaning his own fate, and it's like everything that he sees is only in relation to himself. And so it's like he says he's totally, in some way he's self-absorbed. It's like I know I didn't do anything wrong. Over and over again he's repeating this. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is this happening to me? I didn't do anything wrong, he says. I think though that it will be very clear over the course of the dialogue that this is a kind of transformation or metamorphosis, or metanoia is actually the best word for this, that happens for Job, because again it's as though his self-concern is turned outward, and he suddenly becomes receptive to foremost to God, and then and to others as well. It's and again, I think Elihu with his speech, when he says that that the suffering can actually, it can open our ears. This is another. It's again, it's a kind of symbol for what I'm trying to suggest, which is it seems that Job is really his interior senses. They seem to be closed. By interior senses, I guess I mean just what is not part of the five physical senses, but you know, we sense other people's meanings. We sense again we have a sort of sense of value, of meanings, etc. And these seem to be closed for Job. So his senses, when we say like open your ears, we don't mean just to receive sound waves. We mean to receive understanding, right? And you don't exactly hear understanding. You don't hear understanding with your ears. You hear it through your ears, but it's like your interior senses receive the understanding. This seems to be what was closed in Job. His internal ear was closed. But these trials that he went through somehow, just like Elihu was suggesting, they served to somehow, almost as though they shatter this kind of shell that Job has created around himself with all of his ritualistic observances, etc. And he sort of walled himself in this fixed idea about everything. And suddenly, though, the adversary comes and basically through the suffering penetrates and then shatters Job's shell, and then he has to almost and then he's rendered totally vulnerable. But out of this vulnerability, then he becomes receptive to actually learn something new. At the beginning, Job is totally convinced that he already has all of the answers, and this is what closes his ears to wisdom, so to speak. And so Elihu seems to be, what he says seems to be borne out by the story. And then again, when Job at the end he has his conversion, and he encounters God face to face, and he once again becomes God-fearing. But it's not just because he's somehow following the laws of his religion, but it's rather he's God-fearing because he's encountered God face to face. It's very much like it's very analogous to the not exactly, maybe contemporary in as an oral culture, but the Bhagavad Gita is a extremely it's one of the masterpieces of the literature of humankind, just like the book of Job. It's an Indian, a Persian epic. It's part of a Persian epic. It's part of the Mahabharata. And the Bhagavad Gita tells about Krishna, or basically it tells the story of a conversion, of Arjuna's conversion. And it's quite analogous in important ways to the conversion that Job goes through, which is he has some fixed idea about in Krishna, in Arjuna's case, it's fixed idea about the Dharma. This fixed idea is kind of slowly starts to it's compromised, and then it's finally shattered, and Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna in his ultimate form. So it's a sort of theophany. So it's a direct encounter with the transcendent, and this changes people. It changes Job in a certain way. It changes Arjuna in a certain way, and so and then after that point, they don't their religion. It's not just a matter of following observances from the outside. They don't follow the law because as a sort of external commandments or external rules. It's rather the reason they follow the law is because they've experienced in direct encounter. They've experienced the source of the law. In other words, the law has been written in their hearts, so to speak. Their deeds become expressions of the law, rather than their deeds being somehow subject to the law. The law is no longer something from outside of them. The law can be written from their deeds, again because they've encountered the very source of that law. So much more could be said about the book of Job, but I think it's probably a good place to begin to draw this lecture to a close. The final comment that I would like to make is just back to the idea that is it's right at the heart of so many questions around the book of Job, which is the idea of retribution and scorekeeping, basically. And so I guess what the psychological or internal, the transformative interpretation that I've tried to offer, what it can reveal to us is ways in which our ordinary way of scorekeeping, which would have to do with sort of tallying up material prosperity and trying to think of this as to basically represent the blessings of God. It's like, how rich am I? That must mean God is favoring me if I'm rich. If I'm stricken by poverty, that must mean that God is angry with me. I think the interior reading, or the psychological reading, the interior reading, the transformative reading, it really opens up much wider and much deeper insight that we can have into what sort of relation and transaction we might be sustaining with a being like God. We can just imagine that you had to keep score somehow, and so you were saying like all of the 99 sheep that Job had, and the cattle and the gold and everything in his household, that has a certain value. But how would you compare that value to the value of meeting face to face the creator of the universe, the creating of being as such? In other words, in some way, like when Job's suffering was rewarded 1,000-fold, because no amount of material suffering, it's not even commensurable almost with immediate encounter with God, a theophany. In some way, this is you couldn't measure them one against the other, and so in some way, Job is when Job's possessions are restored to him twofold. In the beginning of Job, as he was at the beginning of the story, would have probably been delighted. One gets the sense, reading the book of Job, that when his possessions are restored to him at the end, that for Job it's something of an afterthought. Like it doesn't really change anything. And so I guess that's I suppose a good place to conclude. I'll just leave it with that thought, And then again, I would invite I welcome further discussion. So I would invite anyone with comments or criticisms or remarks, etc. And so on that note, I will draw the video to a close, but not before wishing everyone the very best, and until next time.